Hi there, and welcome to lecture number 2 in Journalism 333. It's me again, Kathy Schafran. Today we want to talk about what is news. It seems a very basic question, and yet if you would think about it for a minute, you might have a very difficult time actually explaining it to somebody else. If you were trying to say to somebody, here is exactly what news is, think for a second, what would you say? So while you're thinking about it, I want to remind you all, I believe you are all required to have taken Journalism 200 as a prerequisite to the course. And if you did, you probably used this textbook, which is News Reporting and Writing by the Missouri Group. And they have an extensive chapter in here that talks about what news is. I like to use it as a background to talking about this. So if you have the book still and want to review it, feel free to go ahead and do that. We're just going to spend this 1 week on what is news, and then after this week, you will be required to have a full understanding of what news is, because in the next week, you're going to start pitching a story, and you're going to have to explain to me why your story idea is actually news. So you'll want to pay attention this week. It's just going to be a learning and researching opportunity, but it will help you hone your ideas and your concepts and actually start thinking about what makes something news. What am I reporting on that makes something news? So let's take a quick look. So basically, things that make an item news is something that has relevance, usefulness, and is interesting. Think about that for a minute. It has to be relevant to someone else, or information and news that you could use, or just plain interesting. Something I really didn't know before, and now I've learned it and I know it now. Now, the most important elements when you are trying to decide if information that you are holding on to or are thinking about is actually news or a potential news story has to fit into one of these categories. The biggest category, I think, is impact. I think you really want to stop and think, is the item that I want to talk about, does it impact people in some way? How many people does it impact? Generally, the rule of thumb, something that impacts many people, many people, tends to be a news story in some way. If, on the other hand, you have something that doesn't seem to impact that many people, but you really want to make it a news story, it might seem dull the way it is, think of how you could reform the information that you're presenting as something that is impactful upon people and make it from a dull story into a more interesting story. An example of that, perhaps there are some statistics out about the economy. Statistics in and of themselves are a dull story, but they do have an impact on people. For example, if you want to do a statistical story about the number of homes that were sold this year and the prices on them, you might find that prices are increasing. So to make that an impactful story, it would be something like, people thinking about buying their homes right now will have a better time than last month because people are paying more for homes this time around. That way, you have impact on an entire audience that's thinking about selling their home. Another category that you would want to make sure you have to say that an item that you're thinking about actually has news value is there conflict in it? People like to hear stories about conflict. It could be two people angry and fighting with each other. It could be about a company fighting against its workers, or a political group fighting against the government. It could be even natural forces, the winds fighting against the shore turning into a hurricane. Things of conflict make for news. Another area that I'd like to categorize in news is something that makes you say, oh wow. Here we're going to call it a novelty item. But it's just something that's unusual or bizarre, Something that if you reported it to other people, they would say, oh, wow, that is crazy. That is yet another category. Prominence is a category that oftentimes you see in entertainment news. It's just the fact that famous people make news. Famous people, like a movie star, getting divorced or getting married. For the purposes of this class, in and of itself is not news. But if you were to go in entertainment news, you would definitely find that prominence drives everything that they talk about. They're married, having children, getting divorced, having a new movie, getting arrested, doing drugs. Everything that public figures do oftentimes makes news. Hillary Clinton, if she has pneumonia, her health makes news. The authors of the book that I mentioned point out, though, that prominence type of news, public news, actually lacks real relevance and lacks usefulness, which were two of the categories that we talked about earlier on the top of what news needs to have to be news to other people. So prominence in and of itself is a separate category. Then other things that make news happen, their elements in a potential news story would be proximity. Generally, when we say proximity, we're talking about things that happen in your town or close to you or that you have some kind of interaction with, so they're local or hyperlocal, tend to be of interest to you. If there's a story that there's going to be construction on a street where you usually drive to work, that is of news to you because it is close to your house. If I live an hour from where you live, the fact that there's construction on your street is not news to me at all. But proximity, if you have an audience and you know you can reach the audience where something is happening, does indeed make for a news story. And then the topic of timeliness gives us news about something that is new. Typically in broadcast news or in online breaking news, timeliness makes for news itself. For example, something is happening right now tends to be a good news story on television. If that what is happening right now is that there's a traffic tie-up that's blocking traffic for an hour and a half down a particular highway, say I-75, if I am reporting it right now on radio or television, it is news. If I report it tomorrow that there was a traffic tie-up, it probably is not news, unless something specifically happened there that was unique or novel or something like that that fit into one of the other categories. So a wise group of journalists decades ago came up with a list of what your responsibility is as a journalist. To report the news, that's fair enough. We've talked about what news is. To monitor power, meaning watch the politicians and let people know what they're doing. Uncover injustice, if there have been crimes, ongoing crimes. Who's going to tell about those but a journalist? Tell compelling stories that interest people, so you're entertaining in a way. To sustain community, so telling stories about your local areas keeps people tied together so everyone knows what's going on and can interact more effectively with each other. To curate information, that is, there might be statistics out there that if accumulated and put together would tell a very interesting fact, and who really wants to spend the time to put all that information together, so you as a journalist are doing it for them. To set the record straight in a conflict, to explain what those sides of the conflict is, and to be accurate, fair, and unbiased. What do we mean by accurate, fair, and unbiased? Accuracy, you want to make sure your facts are correct, the events you're talking about are correct, you've got your names and your dates and your statistics and your places and your quotes all correct. So you want to verify that and recheck those a couple of times. You might want an extra source. Use reliable sources for your statistics. You will find in this day and age you can go on the internet and find just about anything. So you want to double check your sources. Use facts for your story and include all the necessary facts. Don't say, well, this particular fact will make my point. So I'll just use that point instead of some other facts that I found that don't support the thesis that I wanted to say. Similarly, when you're being fair, you have to provide the context for those facts, give the background, give all the relevant sides of the story, and always strive for balance. Look to see if there's another side of the story that you should be telling and go out and find that side. You want to leave out any of your personal bias out of a story, which is oftentimes hard to do because we all come with a certain point of bias in our lives from our background and our history. But when you're going, let's say, into a political story and you might be leaning one way, say Republican, and you're doing a story about Democrats, see if you could ask those questions and report on their answers without your perspective and offer just their perspective. And while doing so, use neutral language. Try to avoid adjectives that say the person is stupid or lacks background. Try to be as neutral as possible. So in all that, we've talked about what news is. What is not news? Opinion is not news. Your opinion is not news. If you want to write opinion, then you'll probably want to go into an opinion column or be a columnist or maybe do a personal opinion blog. But in journalism and news, opinion is not news. Something you know about that doesn't have an impact or prominence, just gossip maybe between friends, is not news. And something that has been reported on over and over and over again that is not new is also not news. So we want to keep in mind what is news by reviewing the past categories that we talked about and what is not news. We want to keep both of those in mind. So now that we know what news is, let's look at how you can try to figure out what type of news you might be interested in listening to or news that you might be interested in reporting in the future. Oftentimes, if you go to a newspaper or a TV or radio station and there are multiple reporters, they assign reporters beats, different categories of news that they can cover. So let's take a look at some of those categories. They might help you think about the type of news you might want to work on in the future or the type of news you want to read more about and learn more about. There are reporters who focus mostly on breaking news. They are those who will be sent out to a fire or a homicide or a major traffic accident, something that is happening now. Typically, breaking news reporters have to write fast. They do have to do it immediately, and they have to get the news and report it on the fly. If that's something that you like, the pressure of having to report within moments of learning about the news, that could be something for you. There are environmental reporters, government reporters, police and court reporters, education reporters, consumer reporters who talk about what products are on the market, what you should like and avoid, and oftentimes do the research for you. They can also tell you about scams. Health reporters, plenty of information in that area. Business reporters, politics, entertainment reporters, those who do regional news just in a particular area. Some report on religion and the latest involving religion. Oftentimes religious stories turn into news. All of you are familiar with sports. There is, of course, a line between sports and sports news. Sports news would be a particular sports figure has done something newsworthy. Sports is the games and the numbers and the scores. And then there's technology news, reporting on the latest in technology. Now, how do you find all of this news? If you were sent out and told, go ahead, come up with a news story, how do you even look for sources? How do you come up with something? Well, there's something called the wires. You've heard of AP, Associated Press, or Reuters. They will produce news 24/7. They have reporters around the world and around the country, and they publicize their news, and most news organizations are members of their organization and publish it on their websites as well. You could take the information you got from one of the wire stories and localize that. For example, if it was a story about a health issue that was on a national scale or international, let's say the Zika virus, then you could decide to do a story about whether there are any issues of Zika on the campus of Oakland University. That's an example how you use a wire story. The internet and the wires are pretty much the same. Newspapers fall into the same category. You can look at all of these type of stories and say to yourself, I can use these as an idea for a future story for myself by doing a little bit more independent research, finding local experts, finding somebody who's locally impacted by it, and turn it into a new story of my own. There are stringers and tipsters who would call into a news organization, such as a television or radio station. A tipster would call and say, hey, something is happening at such and such a location. And they would tell you about it, and you would send a reporter if you were an organized news organization. Stringers are people who would call you and say, hey, I can report on that myself, and I'll get that story to you. In TVs and radio stations and newspapers, they often use police scanners, police and fire scanners. Those will give you information about breaking news, such as a fire or a shooting. You cannot rely on the scanners to report. You would have to go out to the location where something was allegedly happening and find the information on yourself. As I mentioned already, you could develop stories from existing stories that you found in the wires, the internet, the newspaper, the radio station. Stories such as fires and accidents and crime are news stories in and of themselves, if you're familiar with any of them going on. You could be a watchdog looking at a problem in a system. You could cover an event. Let's say that there was a protest going on campus. That is an event that you could cover. We know constantly that there are cases in criminal courts that are of interest. Courts are a matter of public record. If you know of a particular court case that's going to be starting that's of newsworthy value, you can go to the courts and look up the records there. Demonstrations, as I mentioned, often good ideas for reporting on breaking news. Disasters and tragedies are always news. Local politics. There's school boards and city council meetings and county commission meetings where every week they discuss a new issue facing that community. Oftentimes you can get many stories, ongoing stories from local politics. Same with state politics. If you wanted to report on a law that is being considered, or if you want to report on a politician, politics is oftentimes a hotbed of locations where you can find information. Oftentimes people have press conferences if they have an issue that they want the press to know about. If you attend one of those, you can report on that and perhaps do some background on it. People give speeches. Oftentimes those turn into newsworthy events. Perhaps there's a famous person giving a speech on campus. What they have to say becomes news. You can investigate something new, something you've heard about that you believe needs research. Or you could consider something like a trend story. Trends are typically statistics that are put together either by a study that's already been done or statistics that you somehow are able to put together by doing your own research, and they often will tell a story. A trend, something like people are now getting married at an older age. That might be a trend story that you find on the internet, and you can localize it by going to marriage counselors or perhaps going to the marriage clerk and taking a look at the average age, and then put that together with a personal story of somebody who's getting married at an older age compared to the age that their parents got married. This is how you take a trend and make it into a story. And then you can just get information from MOS, Man on Street. There might be a major story, whether it's national or statewide, that you feel could best be told by having people give their opinion. An example of that would be if you're doing a story about the fact that the state has decided to open a prison in a particular neighborhood, perhaps you canvass the people on the street to talk about how the community is feeling about the new decision to open a prison in that community. These 21 that we've gone over and listed here on Moodle will give you a good starting point if you're stuck when you're starting to work on your own ideas of how I'm going to come up with a new story. We're going to have an assignment like that in just 2 weeks from now, so be sure to refer back to this. This will be posted on Moodle in print form when you go about sitting down to come up with your own story idea. So now that we have a background on what news is and how you go about looking for it yourself, I want to give you some exercises that will help you understand what news is and how to look for the elements of news. So to give you a better idea of how to tackle assignment number 2 that will help you apply the lessons you just learned, I'd like you to take a breath and then click on the next video, how to do assignment number 2.